Jason Mitchell.
And I'm E.T. Mobley.
Welcome to today's episode of this Funkin Life podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the greatest funk bass songs of all time. And I'm going to get things going here with Cold Sweat by James Brown, which was certainly a bomb that went off in 1967. It changed the whole landscape for musicians everywhere in a number of different ways, one of which was it changed the format for how songs were being written, because before songs had a traditional structure with verses and choruses and pre-choruses and bridges and all that. And then with Cold Sweat, the groove became the thing. The repetition became the thing. And a lot of people were just taken aback and shocked that you could have a song that was a huge hit that was basically one part with a change every once in a while.
Cold Sweat's a great one. I want to talk about Roger Troutman from the band Zap. And they were originally called Roger and the Human Body. And so for their debut album from 1976 called Introducing Roger, Roger is, of course, a multi-instrumentalist, but happens to be a very good bass player. And so there's one track in particular from that album called Freedom, Parts 1 and 2, where he really displays his Larry Graham type slap and pop funk bass technique. So that's definitely on this list for sure.
All right. We can't talk about landmark funk bass performances without getting into Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again by Sly and the Family Stone, which was played by Larry Graham on bass. And he started a revolution of technique with slapping and popping, thumb, and then the pop was the flip side to that. So once that song came out, everybody was scrambling to catch up and incorporate that technique into their arsenal. So then throughout the 70s, you had a lot of guys that came out that embraced that style and took it to another level sometimes. But Larry was the original, and so many of his tracks are classics that, you know, we've got a few on our list to talk about today. So as far as Thank You goes, that bass line has resonated with us in a big way. We've probably covered that song throughout the years more than any other one. Even well after when we became an original band, we still play that song because it's such a great party jam and everybody always loves to dance to it. So it's just a very simple tune. It's focused on a vamp, just a one chord thing without hardly any changes at all. Right. Another one of those bombs that went off musically that changed the whole landscape.
Yeah. Well, I've got Sly Stone himself, speaking of Larry Graham. So after Larry Graham left the group, Sly made an album called High on You in 1975. Sly had already been playing bass on several Sly and Family Stone tracks in earlier years, but it seemed that towards the mid-70s, Sly's bass playing chops got better, much better. So from this album in particular, I'm looking at the song Who Do You Love and Crossword Puzzle, where Sly really demonstrates his bass playing ability and, of course, influenced by Larry Graham.
Right. Yeah, Who Do You Love has got a very swinging part. It's really got a swagger to it. There's also some fuzz bass going on in that track where he switches it on and off in certain parts. That is definitely a slammin' bass track. And all the other tracks on that album have killer parts as well, but that one stands out. I'm going to pivot to Super Bad, another James Brown song, which has a young Bootsy Collins on it.
Oh, yeah.
And that part really stands out because it's so commanding and dominating in that track. It's based off of an octave lick, and it's very simple musically, but again, it's played with such authority and conviction, and it really sets the table for the whole song. Some of James's songs are geared around the drums, obviously. That particular one is really about the bass, I think.
Oh, yeah.
The bass is the dominant sound happening in that track for me.
Absolutely. Speaking of Bootsy Collins, of course, his work with Parliament Funkadelic, his own solo career, his work with Zap. That's what I want to talk about right now. So let's cut straight to Mothership Connection, Parliament Funkadelic from 1975. Bootsy co-wrote with George Clinton all over that album and played bass. This is not one of their commercial songs from that album. It's one of their B-side songs, but Unfunky UFO has to be at the top, one of the top funk-based songs of all time. Bootsy Collins, of course, performs that. I want to go also to Bootsy's solo album called Stretching Out and Bootsy's Rubber Band called I'd Rather Be With You, which has been sampled by so many different rap artists and whatnot over the years. There's also his album The name is Bootsy Baby from 1977. Once again, Bootsy just performs his magic on bass, and the track that really stands out in my mind is Munchies for Your Love. I was thinking about Zap, again, Roger Troutman, where George Clinton, Bootsy Collins, and Roger Troutman produced this album. It was actually Zap's debut album from 1980. But there's a track in particular on that album called Be Alright. And Bootsy is just playing one of his funkiest bass lines ever also on that song.
Yeah, he has a very identifiable style. After his James Brown time, he developed this way of playing that incorporated the use of effects pedals like the Mutron, a lot of electroharmonic stuff in the mid-70s. And it became this massive wall of sound that his bass was throwing out there. And the way that he was approaching playing the bass was different too.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't the same old roots and fifths and walking lines that even he was using on stuff like Talking Loud and Saying Nothing,
Right.
which is another fantastic James Brown track that he played on.
Right.
But by the mid-70s and the Parliament Funkadelic years, he had incorporated effects and this style of playing that was very different. And other people, again, rushed to copy him because of that sound was very appealing. I want to get into the song In Time.
Oh, yeah.
The first track on the Fresh album by Sly and the Family Stone, and we have Rusty Allen playing that part. It kind of makes your head spin a little bit because he's locked in, and the time between the bass and the drums is so solid, but it's also very fluid. It's moving, and there's a lot of different riffs and syncopations going on there. It's hard to see how you can keep that together because it's so challenging to play that and not get lost or have a train wreck.
What a confusing bass line that was. Just an ingenious bass line part.
Mm-hmm. A lot of little sliding notes and things that
Absolutely.
he incorporated into the basic groove. So that's another stylistic monument to playing the bass in the early 70s.
I want to talk about Earth, Wind & Fire's Verdine White for a second. There's a track, it's actually a single that came out in 1977 called Brazilian Rhyme. And this song was inspired by Maurice White due to a month-long trip that he took to Argentina and Brazil. Everything about this track is mind-blowing, from the vocals to the string arrangements, the instrumentation, the guitars, but in particular, Verdine White's bass line really creates a vibe, a serious vibe in the song. And there's really no slapping and popping at all. It's just his very smart choice of melodic notes and his percussive approach, his rhythmical approach to the song, which really stands out for me.
Yeah, he definitely has his own voice on the bass, and it's pretty identifiable. He makes Earth, Wind & Fire's music so top-notch.
Absolutely.
That whole band is full of great playing and writing and everything all the time, but he's part of that equation. I want to move to a track now, which is definitely one of the all-time classic Tower Power tracks, which is called Only So Much Oil in the Ground. And this one is relentless. This has such a driving and insistent part to it that doesn't really let up a whole lot. So it's a challenge to play it just from a stamina point of view. And the chord changes in that song are rather simple, but what he does is so inventive and creative in the way that he drives the notes one direction and the other. They walk up, they walk down chromatically. There's just all kinds of clever things that he does to put a part together. And he plays like nobody else. I mean, you can point to the Mount Rushmore of bass players. You got Jamerson, you got Larry Graham, you got Rocco, you got Jaco.
Right.
There's other guys that are important too, but those are the landmark guys who showed everybody a new way of playing. And for me, that song epitomizes the greatness of Rocco Prestia.
Yeah, so I want to talk about, of course, Mr. Larry Graham, now that we're on the subject with him. Of course, he had just too many songs to name.
Yeah, we can't do all of them. We'll pick a few.
I'll pick two. And these are actually not coming from Sly and Family Stone, they're coming from Graham Central Station. The first track I want to talk about, and in my opinion, these two songs, just some of his absolute best work in later years, was from the Release Yourself album 1974, the title track Release Yourself in particular, where Graham is just playing this very up-tempo gospel slap and pop church bass line feel it just drives you crazy. It's just like, how can anybody play that consistently and not fall to pieces?
He's a force of nature. Absolutely.
While singing.
Yeah, he does all that stuff. I like that apparatus he rigged up, where he had the microphone rigged up like in the center of his chest so he could move around and play, and he still had the mic to sing.
Unique.
Funny. While we're talking about Larry, I want to get into a couple of my favorites by him. One is Hair.
Oh.
Which I love the way that track starts, because it's just him on the bass, and then when the other instruments start to fall in, you get this picture of syncopation where the guitar locks in its own way. It fills in some of the gaps. Yeah. Everything just comes together, and it's a great sound.
Yes.
Because when the bass first comes in, you're like, what's that thing doing? You know, it's unusual. You're trying to figure out where all the one is. You know, all the one counts are.
Right,
But then when the guitar and the drums comes in, it all makes sense. It all fits together perfectly.
And Calumet covered Hair.
We did, yeah. For a while we played that. And then I got to get to my favorite Larry Graham track of all time, which is a tornado of funkiness. It is The Jam from 1975.
Oh, absolutely.
And it starts out with a Hendrixy fuzz tone riff. The riff is basically going down.
Yeah.
Which is a classic song that Jeff Beck recorded, and many other people, Freddie King.
Yeah.
But after that riff, he goes into this groove, which is so fierce.
Right.
It is so incredibly fierce. So that's one of my favorite Larry Graham songs.
And I got one more Larry Graham song for you. Now Do You Want to Dance? Again, from that title track of that album, which came out in '77. In my opinion, you could tell that even he was influenced by Bootsy Collins, because he had some effects on that bass line. But, you know, the force of nature with Larry Graham, what can you say?
I want to go back to Earth, Wind & Fire for a second. One of my favorites, which is Yearnin' and Learnin'.
Okay.
Now, that track for me is really the epitome of Verdine White, because he is so locked in. He is one with the drums, and that's the most important thing. So as great as he was, as much chops as he had, he never lost being totally locked in with the drummer. And he was still able to be inventive with connector notes and syncopation and melodies and things that made the track interesting. But that song grooves really, really hard.
Yeah, I would definitely say Verdine, as you said, presents the textbook of how to play bass and drums
in a band context, where he has all the chops that he needs, but he is really meshed with the rhythm section. Great point.
I want to bring up another gentleman, and this is from, I guess you would consider, the first soul and funk group to break into the industry, which would have been the Five Stairsteps. And they actually broke into the music industry before Sly and the Family Stone, before the Jackson 5. But this was a family group, once again, the Burke brothers and sisters. And in particular, Kenny Burke, who was the bassist for the Five Stairsteps. They came out with an album, and this is well after Ooh Child and all that, but in 1975-76, they came up with a kind of like a conceptual album, not disco, funk, more soul, and it happened to be under George Harrison's record label, Dark Horse.
Right? What's the album called?
It's called The Second Resurrection, by the Stairsteps, not the Five Stairsteps, because by then I think one of the sisters left the band. So you just had the Stairsteps, and in particular, there's a track on there called From Us to You. Kenny Burke just destroys this song on bass, and you think that you're listening to Larry Graham.
Wow.
Literally. He just nails all the slapping and popping techniques. It's incredible.
And bringing it full circle, he played on Sly and the Family Stone's last great album, Back on the Right Track,
Remember
1979.
Who You Are. That's absolutely
right. Remember Who You Are. And one of my favorite cuts on that album, which I guess you would say is probably my favorite Kenny Burke track, is The Same Thing That Makes You Laugh Can Make You Cry. I love the mix on that track. It sounds so good.
Yeah.
And his playing is so locked in and creative. And that's a real gem.
Oh, yeah.
I want to move into a guy who really is one of the Mount Rushmore guys of bass, which is Jaco Pastorius. His first solo album is a tidal wave of influence for all of us. I've read a lot of guys that learned how to play bass by trying to cop songs on that, and to make that your first challenge is pretty daunting. because there's some cuts on there. Two I want to highlight. One is the obvious choice, which is Come On, Come Over, which is incredibly funky. He's got Sam and Dave singing on it.
Oh, yeah.
But his bass lines on that track are so incredibly funky. It's a textbook. I mean, if you're playing the bass, you gotta sit down with that track and get as much as you can out of that. It's hard, but it's fantastic. The other one is Kuru, Speak Like a Child. This is an amazing stamina piece because he plays this figure over and over again with such intensity. And as complicated as he plays usually, this is a very simple line that he plays over and over again. But he just shows you, yeah, I can do this all day long.
Right.
I can play this until I feel like stopping, and it might be 20 minutes from now.
Right.
But the lick is amazing, and then it goes into some beautiful jazz fretless playing in the same track. So it goes back and forth between this ferocious, fast, repetitive cycle over and over again, and then into the jazz fretless playing with Herbie Hancock.
One of the things I really admire about Jaco is the fact that he really didn't focus on slapping and popping.
No, that was not his thing at all.
Note player.
He didn't want to jump on that because by the time that became a thing, he had already started being who he is, who he was, and he was a little sheepish. From what I've read, a little, put out by having to prove that he could do it, because of course he could do it.
Right.
But that was somebody else's bag. He only wanted to do his stuff. He wanted people to know him for what he did, not because he was copying Larry Graham or somebody else.
Good point. Yeah, I also, for all of you funketeers out there, this is kind of like one of the funk staple tunes ever known, called Glide by the band Pleasure. And this came from the album Future Now from 1979. So the bassist in that group, Pleasure, was named Nathaniel Phillips. And you talk about slap and pop on the song Glide. If I'm not mistaken, Calumet covered that song.
We did play that, yeah. And that I remember that was a challenging arrangement. There was some unusual stuff going on there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's a little off the beaten path. He didn't just stick to the cliched ideas that everybody else was getting into, because that was the height of disco right there.
Absolutely. Yeah. He took slapping and popping and made it his own, especially in that particular song. So kudos to Nathaniel Phillips.
By that point, everybody would have had not only Larry Graham to dig on, but also Louis Johnson.
Oh.
So I got to mention Get the Funk Out My Face, because that is another one of those tracks from 1976. Two parts in that song, totally different sounding. It's like cut and pasted together, but it works and it's awesome. So
just love that too.
I love how his bass plays melodies and it plays the main theme of the song while still keeping the groove down.
Absolutely.
So that's another landmark track.
Yeah, speaking of Brothers Johnson and Louis Johnson, we're going to talk about Quincy Jones's album from 1975 called Mellow Madness. He actually took that opportunity in 1975 to introduce them, and I would say probably the funkiest track on that particular album is called Is It Love That We're Missing? And in that track, Louis Johnson just creates this very funky vibe. It makes the song. His slapping and popping is minimal, but it is in there. But just his slides and just his genius approach to that bass line, I think is very admirable.
No doubt.
Yeah.
I also want to circle back to P-Funk again, because a track called Together on the Chocolate City album features Bootsy's playing. Again, to me, it really encapsulates his use of effects and his unique style that he came up with by the mid-70s, which was very different than the James Brown era. By 1975, he had this massive sound that he frequently used, the Mutron effect pedal by Electro-Harmonics, plus a few other things, and really staked out some turf. He not only had his own style of playing, but he had his own sound because of the use of the effects pedals. And not a lot of people were really using those. Some people, like even Larry Graham, had used fuzz tone before, and Sly. But Bootsy would use the fuzz, he would use the Mutrons, and it really just became a signature of his. So he was one of those few guys that you could identify within a couple of notes.
I want to add to that. So you're talking about the Chocolate City album from 1975. That's Parliament. And there's another track, and Bootsy's all over, of course, that album as well. There's another track on that album on a side note called Side Effect, where he's using the Mutron effect. I mean, it's total Bootsy, man. It's so identifiable when he plays.
And you know what's great about the Mutron in particular is it gives the bass a personality and a sense of humor, because when you hear it, you have to smile.
Right.
It's kind of like a little bit of an auto-wah, an envelope filter, but mixed with something else. And that sound, for whatever reason, it just puts a smile on your face and makes you happy.
Absolutely.
And, it's endured for many years. So, people love wah-wah pedals and other things. But for the bass, the Mutron style effects, the envelope filters and things really give the bass a lot of character and a sense of humor, which was huge for P-Funk because they were all about the humor. Anything else?
I think that's it.
All right. Thanks for hanging out with us for this episode of this Funkin' Life podcast. We'll see you next time. Please check out our Patreon page below for all kinds of exclusive content from our band Calumet. We have live concert clips, there's photos, unreleased songs, and more. We really appreciate your support.